I'd like to welcome Dr. Valeria Manzano. She's a professor of history at the University of San Martin and a researcher at the National Council of Scientific and Technical Research in Argentina. She's the author of The Age of Youth in Argentina, Culture, Politics, and Sexuality from Perón to Videla, Un siglo joven, Juventud, Cultura y Política en la Argentina del siglo XX, and La última ilusión, Cultura, Política y la crisis de la Revolución en América Latina, as well as 24 articles and chapters. She has been visiting professor at the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva, University of Cologne, Diego Portales, Santiago de Chile, and University of Costa Rica, among others. She is currently completing the archival research of a book project tentatively titled The Last Snapshots of the Latin American Revolution, Culture, Politics, and Nostalgia. Please help me welcome Dr. Manzano. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rosa, for introducing me, and all of you for being there. And I really want to stress my gratitude to the Latin American and Iberian Institute for having me in December as a Richard Greenleaf Fellow. I was visiting UNM specifically to work with Margaret Randall's papers, which are really, really important for the project I will be talking to you today. So I will start sharing my presentation, and my goal today is to offer some insight into that project and specifically to tell you what Margaret Randall's papers having right now help me to fulfill of that particular project. So let's try to share my here. Okay. So I started this project in 2020 in the pandemic, and it was only a project with a very big question. And the big question is when, where, and how did the left-wing revolutionary projects and imaginations in Latin America end? So the central goal of this project, of this research, is to answer to this general question. And in doing so, it's to shed new light into the history of the left-wing political culture, from the victory of the Nicaraguan Revolution in 1979 to the critical biennium of 1989-91, which was eventually marked by the electoral defeat of the Sandinistas and also by the so-called democratic revolutions that swept across Eastern Europe and the collapse of the former Soviet Union, right? So in many respects, the historiography, I'm a historian, the historiography has tended to look very closely to that finale of that biennium, 1989-1991. But in doing so, it has, in my view, sidestepped a more thorough examination of the resilience of the left in the 1980s. So in my project, I will show that, at least in Latin America, that political culture brought together millions of people, although with very different modalities and intensities, they kept working for and believing in revolutionary projects, seeking perhaps to reconcile longstanding struggles for social and economic equality and anti-imperialism with a renovated agenda centered on democracy and equality in gender, sexual, and racial milieus as well. So the history of this study, or my study, contends that the would-be last snapshots of the Latin American Revolution collaborated with the persistence and transformation of the global left-wing political culture in the 1980s. So this story of the left in Latin America in the 1980s is organized around the Sandinista experience in Nicaragua, but it's not, strictly speaking, history of that revolution, right? And I want to point out that from the perspective of today, it is really difficult, at least for me, to connect Sandinismo and Nicaragua with the left today. right? Because since his return to government in January 2007, Daniel Ortega, still in the name of Sandinismo, relied on an alliance with business corporations and other very powerful actors, including the security forces. And his government tended to be increasingly authoritarian and repressive. And many people who are actually today suffering from political prison and exile are in fact people who live in my own research, right? But they live in my research in the past, in the recent, but at times it seems very remote past, of a moment in which La Causa Sandinista, I will call that, became possibly the only common ground for a rather heterogeneous and fragmented Latin American left. So my central thesis of this research is that in the 1980s, La Causa Sandinista was the common ground or the cement for a heterogeneous left-wing political culture in Latin America. Nicaragua was, at the beginning of the 1980s, a symbolic and material space for the meeting of contingents of people who came from different traditions of the left, with different national, generic, and generational origins. In addition, the type of political experience that the Sandinistas led at that point was very different from one for contemporary ones, including Cuba, but Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and that made it particularly kaleidoscopic, right? Everyone could find affiliations and possibilities. The Sandinista experience allowed left-wing militants and sympathizers imagine possible encounters between revolution and democracy, between revolution and social movements, for example, of women's, of youth, to name a few, or between Marxists and Christians, in a context in which, since the arrival of Reagan to the US government in 1981, the cycle of David versus Goliath was renewed. So the struggle for the survival of Nicaragua implied an update, in my view, of the anti-imperialist dimension of the Latin American left, which was one of the crucial components of a political culture in which the projects and imaginaries of revolution also figured very prominently. So the Sandinista experience acted as a glue for that continental political culture, and in some of its sections also facilitated its transformation. In the debates about the possible encounters, revolution and democracy, revolution and social movements, in the ways in which, especially in the last third of the 1980s, the significance of the myth of revolution was debated among intellectuals, artists, and activists, and finally, in the context of the electoral defeat of February of 1990, in which the fate of Sandinismo painfully represented the end of the revolution in geographical and emotionally close lands, Nicaragua served to convey several crises of the left of the revolution. So this is then the overall framework of this research in terms of the themes, problems, and thesis. But now what I wanted to share with you is a little bit about how I am organizing the research, which will be, I hope, a book in the not so near future. So the book will consist of 6 chapters. I will go very rapidly through the chapters, and I will try to include for each of them what I learned and what I will be using from Margaret Randall's papers, right? Which I basically saw and read in UNN in this. So the first part, or the first chapter, will be called "You Are in Nicaragua." And as it happened with La Habana in the early 1960s and Santiago de Chile in the early 1970s, in the first half of the 1980s, Managua became a hub for the encounter of Latin American left-wing militants and sympathizers, many of them living experiences of exile, especially those coming from South America and the Southern Cone in particular, whether in Venezuela, in Colombia, or most generally in Mexico. Among them, there was a prominent group of writers, intellectuals, and professionals of all sorts, from architects to psychologists. Some of this group stayed for relatively long periods of time in Managua or in Nicaragua in general, while others visited very occasionally, especially for attending conferences or different sorts of gatherings. According to the Nicaraguan Ministry of Tourism, 500,000 foreign people entered Nicaragua between 1979 and 1985, which is a huge number for a country of 3 million people at the time. While there are very, very good studies on the international brigades, one of them is in this picture, the Brigada Latinoamericana Simón Bolívar, that actually fought in the final insurrection in Nicaragua in 1979. There is surprisingly less attention to the bunch of people who either stayed or visited afterwards. So based on government documents, memoirs, oral interviews, and also, of course, the papers of Margaret Randall, this chapter is divided into three main sections, or will be divided into three main sections. First, I will look at the experiences of some of the people who decided to stay for longer periods. Margaret herself, who lived in Managua from 1981 to 1984, but also what some group of people that I basically interviewed, and they wrote their own memoirs. Medical doctors, one architect, one journalist, and two psychologists, one of them coming from different experiences of the Latin American left. The picture above was taken in 1985. It's the place where one of the medical doctors saw and had her patients. She was an Argentinian medical doctor. She was living in exile in Paris, and when the Nicaraguan Revolution started, she decided to move to Managua and to set herself and live there for almost 12 years in her case. So my intention in this chapter is to disentangle their decisions to stay, their everyday lives, including their jobs, the way in which they conducted their family business there, and their political impact. Second, I reconstruct a series of conferences and encounters that took place between 1980 and 1985, chiefly those of writers and intellectuals. My intention there is to show how those largely staged events were crucial in two respects. On the one hand, it allowed for the performances of the Sandinista leadership and their self-representation as educated, open-minded, and pluralistic. And on the other hand, to delineate the scripts of the cultural ambassadors of the Sandinista experiences abroad. Among the intellectuals, many of those who attended conferences or different gatherings wrote then very prominently about what they interpreted as the original combinations of democracy and revolution, and of revolution and social movements, thus very actively contributing to ongoing debates within the left. In addition, there were at least two very important writers, or three, in fact, Gabriel García Márquez, of course, Eduardo Galeano, and especially Julio Cortázar in the picture below the screen, who became possibly the most prominent cultural ambassadors of the Sandinista experience. And in fact, I take from Julio Cortázar, the verse of a poem that he wrote, Noticias para Viajeros. He wrote out in 1980, and he wrote that to represent the perception of the arrival in revolutionary Nicaragua. And I will read the four verses. Ya ves, viajero, está tu puerta abierta, todo el país es una inmensa casa, Nicaragua. No te equivocaste de aeropuerto, entra nomás, estás en Nicaragua. So the "You are in Nicaragua" of the title is taken from this verse in particular. And I think that this poem, who became a song and became a sort of anthem for the people that outside Nicaragua, the Latin Americans who were tending toward the left and outside Nicaragua, made the decision to initiate their travel or their trips to the revolution. So the third level or the third section of this chapter will focus on those political tourists, generally young people, that went to see Nicaragua and left their memoirs. And interestingly, except for those many that participated in some brigades, some others, many of these political tourists, were particularly critical of what they saw. And I use this as a strategic device to discuss the scope and limits of the causa Sandinista as a glue for the Latin American left-wing political culture. So my second chapter moves from Managua to Moscow, and it investigates the participation of the Latin American delegations in the 12th World Festival of Youth and Students, which was held in Moscow in July of 1955, when the terms glasnost and perestroika began to hit the headlines across the globe. Here you have the logo of the festival, which was a pretty common logo for the World Festivals of Youth and Students. So the chapter shows that the Latin American youth delegates did not experience the feeling of an imminent end. And content that by the mid-1960s, the 1980s, excuse me, the beliefs about the persistence of revolutionary projects varied very greatly according to regional, age, and class axis. In that particular festival, the Nicaraguan youth delegation was the most cheered. And the second picture there, it's the cover of a pamphlet that it was in fact a transcript of a talk that Daniel Ortega gave to the delegation of the Nicaraguan delegation to Moscow. And it was an scripted participation, right? The one of the Nicaraguan delegation. Basically, it was the Juventud Sandinista, the leaders of the Juventud Sandinista, the ones who attended, and they were particularly cheered in that festival, not only among Latin Americans, but among left-wing youth from all over the world. Besides reconstructing that event, the chapter also reconstructs the symbolic and political potential of youth as a category, as an actor in the Sandinista experience, and especially for the causa Sandinista abroad. From my own experience working with the history of youth, I found both continuities and shifts in the symbolic and political meanings of youth in the 1980s, with significant implications in the cultural and sexual terrains as well. So besides working with political and cultural periodicals of all sorts from Nicaragua and from all over Latin America, I will also make use of the correspondence of Margaret Randall with her two daughters. Both of them were participants, very active participants of the Juventud Sandinista, and they left pretty detailed accounts of different activities and perceptions and beliefs, which will be, I assume, very important to this chapter as well. In the third section or third chapter, I move to a broader perspective on the history of women's movement and feminism and in the 80s, and to do that, I studied the 5 biannual Encuentros Feministas de América Latina y el Caribe. The first of them was held in Bogotá in 1981. The pictures are taken from that particular encounter. One of them is the delegation of the Dominican women, and the other women coming from experiences in exile. In those encounters, the so-called left-wing feminists helped create a regional and social movement that questioned machismo, gender inequality, and homophobia as much as it struggled against poverty, racism, and imperialism. In those encounters, as well as in many others, Caribbean women, of working women from Latin America, the trope of the Nicaraguan woman was crucial. as it allowed not only for the display of a somewhat rhetoric solidarity, but also to discuss the relations between revolution, women's demands and agendas, and eventually feminism. Many of those women nurtured their understanding of the Nicaraguan woman as a trope with their reading of Margaret Randall, Todas Estamos Despiertas. In English, it was Sandino's Daughters, but in Spanish, it was published by Siglo XXI, and it was called Todas Estamos Despiertas, which is an exemplary piece of testimonio. And it was one of the best-selling books on Nicaragua in the early 1980s. So my intention, I expect to follow up the circulation and, to the best of my possibilities, the reception of the book among the groups and publications that made the women's movement and feminism in Latin America in the early 1980s in particular, and try to grasp how it was one of the pieces that contributed to the renovation of an understanding of left-wing politics and new social movements, in this case, feminism and the women's movement. And the following segment or chapter moves from feminism to music and especially to musical practices. It is called The Last Songs and focuses on the relationship between music and left-wing politics. It follows the story of the institutionalization of the new song movement that took place in the early 1980s by joining several cohorts of politically committed artists, musicians from all over Latin America. This is a very interesting story, it touches me very profoundly, and I found very paradoxically that as a movement, the new song became again institutionalized only in the 1980s, in the early 1980s. It became programmatic, it had its own publications, its own committees, and as part of this institutionalization, musicians, poets, and musicologists convened to 3 successive festivals. One of them, the first, was in Mexico City in 1982. The second in Managua, which is the one, this is the cover of the album that basically was produced in that festival, and the third in Quito in 1984. April in Managua was the name of the album for that festival. Was for a festival that, in my view, was clearly the most successful and significant in political and cultural terms. It was in Managua, it was in April in 1983, and it served to display the vast amount of solidarity. And also, as other festivals, it implied certain pilgrimage. Thousands of young people moved from different countries in Central America and Mexico to attend that festival in Managua. Yet by the mid-1980s, that institutionalized movement started to vanish. And I think that there are several reasons for that, but I wanted to single out 2 of them. One of them was the increasing feeling that these musicians, poets, were basically speaking to the people that were already convinced of being militants and sympathizers of the left. And second, the rising of a relative openness to other aesthetic and cultural expressions, especially among the younger generations of Cuban, Mexican, and Nicaraguan musicians and poets. That openness implied, among other things, the acceptance of rock and pop. And I take as the counterexample for showing this the success of 2 other festivals, very closely organized in time. One of them was called La Paz del Mundo Comienza en Centroamérica. It was held in San José de Costa Rica in April of 1986. And the other are the 4 concerts that the Amnesty International World Tour, called Human Rights Now, organized in 1988. The 4 Latin American concerts were held in San José de Costa Rica. It was not organized in Managua. In San José de Costa Rica, Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, and the last was, the picture is from the last, in Mendoza, also in Argentina, because it could not be been organized in Santiago de Chile, as it was the intention. What is interesting for me is that in terms of the audiences and eventually in terms of the artists that were on stage, especially the one in San Jose de Costa Rica, had basically the same lineup that the previous series of festivals of the new song, right? It was not the case with the Human Rights Now concerts that had very prominent figures of the Sting, Peter Gabriel, and Bruce Springsteen, and stars of the pop and rock scene of the time. But in my view, what changed in terms of the relationship with the previous series of festivals is that even well-established musicians and artists of the rock of the new song movement started to include rock and pop songs into their own repertoires. They included Mercedes Sosa from Argentina, Tania Libertad from Peru, Kila Pazón from Chile. They all started to incorporate new aesthetics, new songs, and to legitimize for that political culture the presence of rock and pop music. So this is one of the transformations. And the other, which I think is particularly important, is that the tropes or the motifs were particularly different, right? In the case of the series of the Nueva Canción festivals, the implications in terms of aesthetics of the songs performed or the stages and even the chants of the audience were all still very much connected to the more politically committed songs, to the revolutionary songs of the 60s and 70s. And now, already in the second half of the 1980s, the same audiences, the same artists were performing or were focusing much more on other tropes, specifically on peace and on human rights. Right? Those tropes, peace and human rights, had started to replace the centrality of revolution. And in this respect, I'm moving to the chapter 5, or the segment 5 of this investigation, which focuses on the last third of the 1980s, and particularly on the debates about the crisis of the projects and the imaginary of revolution. And the chapter starts with the realization that in the 80s, various political forces identified with the left, not only in Central America, but also in South America, still made use of armed struggle. This is not self-evident, right? The historiography, in fact, has tended to look at, well, armed struggle confined to Central America, and in South America, the key processes were the process of democratic transition, and this is simply not true, right? Because in South America as well, there were very, very important groups, left-wing groups, and very different, that resorted to armed struggle as part of their revolutionary projections. After that, and because I think that is in historical terms, it is very, very important for me to show this coexistence of different temporalities and transitions, even in South America. At the same time, I show that an important portion of intellectuals, artists, and left-wing militants were not only talking about democracy, they were also talking about revolution, but they did so in very different terms, right? The revolution was still there, still very present in the third quarter of the 1980s. But when we talk about the revolution, they talked about the crisis of the revolution and the revolution in the past. And very interesting, for me, it was very interesting to see that much of the public conversation on the temporalities and the balance of revolution was connected to commemorations, right? For example, the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the assassination of Ernesto Che Guevara, or the 20th anniversary of the global revolts of 1968, or even the bicentennial of the French Revolution. And in general, the questions were there, like the cover of the magazine, of the journal on my left, ¿qué queda de la revolución? What's left of the revolution? Or the other, ¿de qué hablamos cuando hablamos de revolución? Right, so the revolution was interrogated in cultural and political terms. But what was particularly interesting for me is that only few intellectuals and artists signed the death certificate for the revolution at the end of the 1980s. They were still discussing, they were still debating, they were still trying to figure out what to do with the revolution as imagination. And in addition to nostalgia, and in addition to the way in which these intellectuals and artists, while commemorating several episodes of the past, they were constructing a collective we, a collective subject, tied to their memories of the past. In addition to that nostalgic construction of a generation, the generation of the 60s or the 70s, the revolutionary generation, there was still Nicaragua. Although attention to the Sandinista experience in other Latin American countries waned as the 80s went by, Nicaragua was still there, military besieged, increasingly poor, although willing to fight the electoral battle that it was assumed would be won. So this final chapter or segment of this research will focus especially on the year 1990. And it's called, And Now What? With very few exceptions, a good part of those who participated in that heterogeneous left-wing culture in Latin America were confident in the victory of the presidential formula proposed by the Sandinistas for the elections of February 1990. In part because they followed the opinion polls produced by the most diverse agencies that basically predicted that victory. And perhaps this confidence explains the unease caused by the actual electoral results. Sandinismo obtained 40% of the votes compared to the 54% of the multi-party coalition led by Violeta Chamorro. So that experience that had captivated the most diverse families of the left, not only Latin America, was coming to an end. That the most optimistic believed would be only transitory. The electoral defeat of Sandinismo for most represented the Latin American embodiment of other ends, socialism, of the projects and imaginaries tied to the revolution. Almost immediately, many artists, intellectuals, and militants wrote their impressions about the Sandinista defeat. And I'm sharing with you one of Margaret Randall's poems, dated late February 1990, which she sent to her friends. It was not published. She sent that to her friends. And I think that it is speaking of grief and of mourning. That is speaking of grief and mourning. And this poem, as many other pieces of writing, including poems, are, in my view, crucial pieces to disentangle these pervasive feelings of loss and sadness. As the months went by, sadness, grief, coexisted with the search for an explanation of the defeat, of the Sandinista defeat, and with an emerging criticism on the ways in which the Sandinistas had, for example, managed the economy, the situation of war, and the relation with different social actors, more prominently the peasants and the campesinos. But at the same time, or in addition, some of the most prominent left-wing political forces in the continent, specifically the Brazilian Workers' Party and the Party of Democratic Revolution in Mexico, fueled the creation of one crucial initiative, the Foro de Sao Paulo. The first meeting of the Foro de Sao Paulo, which again was a space for the meeting of, in the first one, of almost 40 political forces of the left. And I'm including here in Spanish the Declaración Final, the final document. For me, it was a critical platform for launching a continental project for the renovation of the left. But not only in the very, very, very months in which the left was still trying to process the electoral defeat of the Sandinismo in Nicaragua, but also attempting to grasp, to do what to do with the emergent wave of neoliberal politics across the continent. So the coincidence between the Sandinista defeat and the launching of the Foro de San Pablo, in my view, signaled the passage from revolution to resistance, a passage through which the revolution was already located in the past and remembered with nostalgia. So this is what I wanted to share with you, with a bit of everything, but it's the overview of the research, and I will leave this screen below. And thank you so much for listening to me. Dejo de compartir. Okay. And so I hear you right now. I hope the time is correct.